Echoes call from hollow halls, a voice that creeps and softly crawls. Time stands still, the air is.
They ventured into nature seeking adventure, challenge, and freedom. But the wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes or bad luck. These are the stories of experienced outdoorsmen, determined adventurers, and dreamers who pushed boundaries only to meet horrifying ends. From frozen mountains to dark caves, these deaths were captured, documented, and remembered as warnings about nature's unforgiving power. They stood together at the mouth of Keyhole Canyon, 7 friends from California and Nevada, smiling for one final photograph before beginning their descent. Mark Mackenzie, 56, of Valencia, Linda Arthur, 57, and Steve Arthur, 58, of Camarillo, Gary Favela, 51, of Rancho Cucamonga, Don Teichner, 55, of Mesquite, Nevada, Muku Reynolds, 59, of Chino, and Robin Brum, 53, of Camarillo had no idea they were documenting their last moments alive. Within hours, they would all be dead, victims of one of the most catastrophic outdoor disasters in American canyoneering history. Monday, September 14th, 2015 began like countless other days at Zion National Park. At 7:40 in the morning, the group picked up their permit for Keyhole Canyon, a narrow slot formation carved by millennia of flash flooding into the red sandstone of southwestern Utah. Park rangers delivered their standard warning about the flash flood danger being probable that day. Storm clouds were gathering. Rain was in the forecast. But the 7 friends, members of California's Valencia hiking crew who had been planning this trip for months, decided to proceed anyway. The group had even taken classes on slot canyon mountaineering. Some members had attended a basic canyoneering course that very morning, learning to rappel into tight spaces. In an August email to the group, Linda Arthur had written about the possibility of flash flooding closing the canyon, adding that they would keep their fingers crossed that it would not happen. But alas, their fingers weren't crossed tightly enough. Between 3:30 and 4:30 in the afternoon, the group entered Keyhole Canyon. The timing proved catastrophic. At 2:22 p.m., the park area came under a flash flood warning from the National Weather Service, publicized through media sources and posted in all of the park's contact stations. Canyons were closed to canyoneering, but the warning came too late. The 7 were already inside the Serpentine Passage, a place where the sandstone walls squeeze so close together that daylight becomes a distant memory overhead. Park spokeswoman Ali Baltras later explained the impossible situation. With such a large park and small staff, rangers cannot alert everyone. While hikers could conceivably receive weather alerts on their phones, cellular reception is poor in the park. The group was unreachable, trapped not just by geography, but by the very technology that might have saved them. Another canyoneering group who had been through Keyhole Canyon just before the flood passed, the group of 7, and later reported to park rangers that they believed the group may have been caught in the flood. One survivor, Jordan Birnbaum, said, "Scary. The wind is wailing and to our left was a cliff, and so we hurried to the mountain on our right." Those witnesses were the last people to see the 7 alive.
Scary because the wind is just, wailing, and to our left is a cliff.
Then, the sky opened up. Between 4:30 and 5:30 p.m., Zion Canyon received 0.63 inches of rain in less than 1 hour. In the desert, such rainfall doesn't soak into the ground. It runs. In one of the park's tributaries of the Virgin River, flows of 50 cubic feet per second swelled to more than 2,000 cubic feet per second in just 15 minutes. Park spokesman David Eaker described what likely happened inside that canyon with chilling simplicity. "It would be just like a drain," he said. "It just funnels down in there very quickly, very fast." The flooding likely rushed over their heads in moments and carried them miles downstream. Jordan, the survivor, further said he saw waterfalls coming through the pathway. In a slot canyon, there is nowhere to run, nowhere to climb. There are only a couple of places they may have been able to find a bit of high ground, Baltras said. But once in the canyon, the only way out is to continue to the end of the route. The water came as a wall of churning violence, carrying rocks, branches, and debris. It filled the narrow passage in seconds, turning a beautiful geological wonder into a liquid tomb. The 7 friends who had spent months planning this adventure together died together in the dark, cold water, their bodies swept miles downstream from where they had last stood alive. By evening, park rangers found their vehicles, but no sign of the group. Keyhole Canyon was already in flash flooding. and due to weather at the time and through the evening, it was determined that rescue operations could not be safely initiated. The search would have to wait until morning. Tuesday at 7 a.m., the search began. Though Keyhole Canyon was still inaccessible to search and rescue crews due to weather and high water levels. At 1:30 p.m., Steve Arthur was located in Clear Creek. At 2:30 p.m., a private canyoneering group went through Keyhole Canyon and reported the location of Gary Favela. At 4:15 p.m., Muku Reynolds was located in Clear Creek. The bodies kept turning up, scattered across miles of drainage. Linda Arthur, mother of 3 and grandmother of 7, was the last person still missing. For days, search crews aided by cadaver dogs combed the rugged terrain downstream. Thursday morning, they finally found her in Pine Creek, miles from where she had entered the canyon with her husband and friends. Steve Arthur was a sergeant with the Ventura County Sheriff's Department. His colleagues had to process the unbearable reality that one of their own had perished in the flood. Don Teichner, the group's leader, was semi-retired from managing his family's garment dyeing facility in Los Angeles. These were experienced hikers with families, careers, and futures. In less than an hour of rain, all of it was erased. Zion's superintendent Jeff Bradybaugh spoke to the media with palpable grief. "Our heartfelt sympathies go out to those affected by the flash flooding in Keyhole Canyon," he said. "We have witnessed an incredible community of the family members and friends of the canyoneers come together to support one another." In the end, 7 friends who loved adventure died doing what they loved, in a place of stunning beauty that became their grave. Their final photograph, taken at the canyon's entrance with smiles and anticipation, remains a haunting reminder that nature doesn't negotiate, doesn't compromise, and shows no mercy to those who underestimate its power. Before we go any further, I just want to ask you for a small favor. If you're enjoying the video so far, please give it a like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. We are pushing to hit 200,000 subscribers before the year ends. It feels impossible, but I know we can achieve it together because your support has been unreal. I know you'll subscribe, so without wasting more time, let's get back to the video. On the 1st of May, 1998, American mountaineer Conrad Anker stood alone on a wind-scoured slope at 27,000 feet on Mount Everest. He was searching for ghosts. What he found instead was a body so perfectly preserved by the mountain's frozen grip that for a moment he thought the man might still be alive. The corpse lay face down in the scree, its back bleached white by 75 years of ultraviolet radiation and wind. The clothing had mostly disintegrated, but fragments of cotton and wool clung to the limbs. Most haunting of all were the hobnailed leather boots, still laced tight on feet that had stopped walking sometime in June of 1924. Anker had stumbled upon George Lee Mallory, the man who had once declared he would climb Everest because it's there. The discovery sent shockwaves through the mountaineering world and reignited one of exploration's most tantalizing mysteries. Did Mallory and his climbing partner Andrew Irvine reach the summit of Everest 29 years before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay received credit for the first ascent? The question had haunted climbers for 3/4 of a century. On the 8th of June 1924, Mallory and Irvine were last seen alive by teammate Noel Odell, who watched through breaks in the clouds as 2 tiny figures moved upward near the summit. Odell later wrote that he saw them going strong for the top. Then the mist closed in, and they vanished into legend. The 1998 expedition, funded by the BBC and led by climber Eric Simonson, had set out specifically to solve this riddle. The team included some of the world's elite high-altitude climbers. Their mission was simple but daunting: search the death zone for any trace of the 2 British climbers who had disappeared without a trace. When Anker found Mallory's body, it was lying in a position that told a terrible story. The right leg was broken, crossed over the left. The arms were extended upward, frozen in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to arrest a fall. The rope around his waist had snapped, its frayed end suggesting enormous force. Most telling of all was the pattern of injuries: a significant blow to the forehead, broken ribs, and that shattered leg. His snow goggles were found in his pocket, indicating that he might have died during a nighttime descent. The team worked carefully in the thin air, photographing everything before conducting what amounted to an archaeological examination of a man who had been their hero. They found personal effects, letters from Mallory's wife Ruth, an altimeter, a pocket knife, and a sock with his name on it. But one item was conspicuously absent: the photograph of Ruth that Mallory had promised to leave on the summit. "It was the most surreal moment of my life," Anker later recalled in interviews. Here was this person who had been so mythologized, and he was right there in front of me, so utterly human and vulnerable. The team also noted what they didn't find. Mallory carried no oxygen apparatus. Though the expedition had brought several bottles, some of the oxygen sets had been found abandoned lower on the mountain, suggesting equipment failures. The climbers had been pushing for the summit dangerously late in the day, racing against darkness and weather that would have killed them within hours of sunset. Jochen Hemlib, the expedition's researcher who had spent years studying historical photographs and documents to pinpoint search areas, examined every clue. The body's location at roughly 27,000 feet, well below the summit but along the logical descent route, suggested the men had been coming down when disaster struck. But, coming down from where? The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Where was Irvine? His body remains missing to this day. More critically, did they reach the top? The climbing rates Odell observed suggested they might have been high enough, but many experts argued the technical difficulties of the second step. A nearly vertical rock barrier near the summit would have been impossible to climb with 1920s equipment. The expedition made the decision to leave Mallory where he lay, burying him under rocks in an impromptu cairn. Dave Hahn, one of the team members, read Psalm 103 over the grave. The mountain that had kept Mallory's secret for 75 years became his final resting place once more. The 1998 discovery didn't solve the mystery. It only made it more human, more heartbreaking. Somewhere on that mountain, Andrew Irvine likely lies in a similar state of preservation, possibly still carrying the Kodak camera that might contain proof of their achievement. Until that camera is found, the question remains suspended in the thin air of history. What the discovery did prove was something perhaps more important, that the mountain remembers everything, and eventually it gives up its dead. In early September of 1992, moose hunters discovered a disturbing scene inside an abandoned bus along Alaska's Stampede Trail. The body of a young man lay in a sleeping bag, emaciated and alone. His remains weighed just 67 pounds. Beside him was a diary that chronicled his final days, and on a piece of plywood near the bus's entrance, someone had carved a desperate plea for help. The young man was 24-year-old Christopher Johnson McCandless, a recent college graduate who had walked into the Alaskan wilderness 4 months earlier with almost nothing. He carried 10 pounds of rice, a small caliber rifle, a camera, and several books. He had no compass, no map of the area, and no means of communication with the outside world. What he did have was an idealistic dream of living off the land, free from the constraints of modern society. Christopher had renamed himself Alexander Supertramp, abandoning his former life with a fervor that alarmed his family. After graduating from Emory University in 1990 with honors, he donated his entire $24,000 savings to charity, cut ties with his parents, and began wandering across America. His journey took him through the deserts of the Southwest and up the spine of the continent, until he finally hitchhiked to Alaska in April of 1992. The last person to see Christopher alive was Jim Gallion, an electrician who picked him up outside Fairbanks. Gallion later recalled being worried about the young man's lack of preparation. He wasn't carrying anywhere near as much food and gear as you'd expect, Gallion remembered. The experienced Alaskan tried to convince Christopher to accept better equipment and even offered to drive him to Anchorage to buy proper supplies, but the young man refused. When they parted ways on April 28th, Gallion watched as Christopher walked into the wilderness with nothing but a backpack and his stubborn determination. Christopher found his way to an abandoned Fairbanks City Transit bus that had been left along the trail, converted it into his shelter, and began his experiment in self-reliance. His diary entries from those first weeks radiated optimism and joy. He hunted small game, foraged for edible plants, and photographed his surroundings. On May 5th, he shot a porcupine. By late May, he had successfully killed a moose, but his lack of experience proved catastrophic. He couldn't properly preserve the meat, and it spoiled in the warming weather. The waste devastated him. In his journal, he wrote about his disgust at the loss and what he called the greatest tragedy of his life. But the real tragedy was still unfolding. Sometime in mid-July, Christopher decided to leave the bus and return to civilization. When he reached the Teklanaka River, the same waterway he had easily crossed in April, he found it transformed. Spring snowmelt had turned it into a raging torrent impossible to cross on foot. What he didn't know was that a hand-operated tram existed just a quarter-mile downstream, and that crossing points existed less than a mile away. Without a map, he never found them. He turned back to the bus. now truly trapped. His journal entries grew shorter and more ominous. By late July, he was writing about weakness and struggling to hunt effectively. He began eating wild potato seeds and other plants he had identified using a foraging guide. On July 30th, he wrote a single word: extremely weak. On August 5th, much trouble just to stand up. His body was consuming itself. The exact cause of his death has been debated for decades. Initially, it was believed he died from starvation alone, but later analysis suggested he may have been poisoned by eating seeds from wild potato plants containing a toxic amino acid that prevents the body from metabolizing nutrients. In essence, he was starving even as he ate. Other researchers have disputed this, pointing to mold toxins or simple caloric deficit. What remains undisputed is the agony of his final weeks. His last journal entry came on August 12, 1992, about 113 days after he entered the wilderness. On the back of a page torn from a book, he wrote what became his farewell: "I have had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye, and may God bless all." Beside these words, he had scrawled SOS, "I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me." But no one came. Christopher McCandless died alone in that rusted bus, surrounded by the wilderness he had romanticized but never truly understood. His body wasn't found for more than 2 weeks. The young man who sought transcendence in nature instead found only hunger, isolation, and a slow death that could have been prevented by the very things he rejected: preparation, knowledge, and connection to other human beings. The wind screams over the high ridges of the Cascades, a sound that usually signals warning to those who know the language of the mountains. But in May 1986, for a group of teenagers from the Oregon Episcopal School, the warning signs were lost in the excitement of a rite of passage. They were young, vibrant, and trusting. They had prepared for months to climb Mount Hood, a dormant volcano rising over 11,000 feet into the Oregon sky. It was supposed to be a triumph of spirit and teamwork, a core requirement of their base camp program, modeled after the principles of Outward Bound. Instead, it became a story of such profound horror that for years it stood as the second worst alpine disaster in North American history. It began with deceptive calm. On Mother's Day, May 11th, the group of 20 gathered at Timberline Lodge. There were 15 students, a few adults, and 2 guides. Leading them was Father Thomas Goman, the school's 42-year-old chaplain and an experienced mountaineer. He was a man the parents trusted implicitly with their children's lives. They set out into the dark at 3 in the morning on Monday, May 12th. The snow crunched under their boots, and the silence of the pre-dawn alpine world swallowed them. At that hour, the mountain was a sleeping giant, beautiful and serene. But the mountain was waking up, and it was angry. The weather forecast had predicted terrible conditions, yet Goman made the fatal decision to push on. He believed they could beat the storm. As they climbed past the 7,000-foot mark, the first doubts began to creep in. Hillary Spray, a student who was suffering from stomach pain, decided to turn back early with her mother, Sharon. Hillary later recalled the pressure she felt to keep going, noting that Goman pressured the kids and everyone assumed he knew what was best. Her illness likely saved her life. As she descended, her mother, Sharon, watched the rest of the group fading into the white distance, the sounds of their movement growing fainter with each passing step. It was a haunting final image. By the time the group reached the Hogsback Ridge, the weather had turned violent. The blue sky was gone, replaced by a blinding wall of white. Winds roared to near hurricane force, and the temperature plummeted. Matt Zaffino, a meteorologist who knows the mountain well, explained that when a storm like this hits, it hits fast. It is not just moving from point A to point B. The weather develops directly over your head. The tragedy began to unfold in slow, agonizing motion. Patrick McGinnis, the youngest boy at just 15, began to falter. His lean runner's frame had no defense against the biting cold. He started slurring his speech and toppling over, classic signs of hypothermia. The group, now deeply in the death zone of the storm, made a critical decision. They stopped. They huddled around Patrick, trying to warm him. Susan McClave, a senior student, heroically removed her own jacket and boots to climb into a sleeping bag with him, sharing her body heat. It was a noble act of love, but it cost them precious time. Disoriented by the whiteout and the cognitive decline brought on by the cold, Goman led them off course. They were no longer heading down, but but traversing sideways, perilously close to the glaciers. Ralph Summers, the professional guide, realized the danger. He saw cracks in the snow, the gaping maws of crevasses waiting to swallow them. Trapped at 8,200 feet, with darkness falling and students unable to walk, Summers made the desperate call to dig in. They dug a snow cave. It was a tiny, wretched hole, barely 4 feet high and measuring just 6 by 8 feet. Into this claustrophobic space, 13 people squeezed themselves. It was meant to be a shelter, but it became a tomb. Inside, the body heat melted the walls, leaving them sitting in a bowl of freezing sludge. The air grew stale and thin. Panic set in as they gasped for breath. For 2 days, the storm raged. Outside, rescue teams faced winds of 103 miles per hour. Conditions so severe that even the heavy snowcats were flipped over like toys. Mark Kelsey, a seasoned rescuer with Portland Mountain Rescue, remembered the winds as the worst he had ever seen. He described the agony of facing the parents waiting at the lodge, seeing their faces of hope and desperation, silently begging for a miracle that the rescuers could not yet provide. Inside the cave, hope was dying. Summers and a student named Molly Shula made a last-ditch attempt to find help. Summers wrote later that the only chance to keep alive was to strike out and keep walking. Against all odds, they stumbled into a ski resort miles off course, alive but unable to pinpoint the cave's location for the rescuers. The end, when it came, was heartbreakingly quiet for some, and violent for others. 3 students, which include Allison Litzenberger, Aaron O'Hare, and Eric Sandvik, had left the cave in a desperate bid for life, or perhaps delirious from hypothermia. Rescuers found them later. Kelsey described finding 2 of them in the fetal position, curled together to stay warm, frozen in a final embrace on the mountainside. It took the intuition of a master sergeant named Richard Harder, known as the Bagger, to find the rest. He had a hunch about a specific area, and marked it with a smoke flare. When the search team probed the snow there, they hit something solid. Then came the smell. Pierre Bobby of the Seattle Mountain Rescue Council recalled that a pararescue man stuck his head down, smelled the void, and knew immediately they were on target. It was the scent of death. But from that darkness came a faint sound, moaning. Buried beneath the bodies of their friends were 2 survivors, Brenton Clark and Giles Thompson. They were pulled from the pile of 13, clinging to life by a thread. The other 9 were gone. In July of 1936, 23-year-old Tony Kurtz hung suspended on a rope in the middle of the Eiger's north face, so close to rescue that he could speak to his would-be saviors. For hours he fought against exhaustion, frostbite, and a body pushed beyond its limits, trying desperately to reach safety that remained just meters away. His rescuers watched helplessly as one of the most agonizing deaths in mountaineering history unfolded before their eyes. The Eiger's north face, known as the Nordwand or Murder Wall, had never been successfully climbed. Rising nearly 6,000 feet of sheer limestone and ice in the Swiss Alps, it had already claimed multiple lives. But in the summer of 1936, the mountain became an obsession for young climbers across Europe, particularly in Germany and Austria, where alpinism had become intertwined with national pride under the Nazi regime. Tony Kurtz and Andreas Hinterstoisser, both German army mountain guides, teamed up with 2 Austrian climbers, Willi Angerer and Eddie Reiner. On July 18th, the 4 men began their attempt on the north face. They were strong, experienced climbers, and initially made good progress. Hinterstoisser led the team across a crucial section of smooth rock, using a pendulum traverse technique, swinging across on a rope where no handholds existed. Behind them, they pulled the rope across, not realizing this decision would seal their fate. By the second day, everything had gone wrong. Angerer had been struck by falling rocks and was seriously injured. The weather deteriorated rapidly, and the team made the decision to retreat. But when they returned to the smooth traverse that Hinterstoisser had led them across, they discovered a fatal problem. Without the rope anchored from the other side, the traverse was impossible to reverse. They were trapped on the face with a wounded man, dwindling strength and a storm closing in. The 4 climbers attempted to rappel straight down instead, but the mountain offered no mercy. Hinterstoisser fell first, his body tumbling thousands of feet to the base of the wall. Angerer, already injured, either froze to death or was strangled when the rope wrapped around his neck during the descent. Reiner was found dead, hanging from his rope above Angerer, frozen in place. That left only Tony Kurtz, suspended on a rope in the middle of the north face, completely alone. His position was visible from the windows of a railway station carved into the mountain, and railway workers heard his cries for help echoing across the rock. On the morning of July 22nd, a rescue team from the railway managed to reach a window opening onto the face and called out to Curse. He answered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm the only one alive," he shouted back. What happened next remains one of the most harrowing rescue attempts ever documented. The guides could see Kurtz hanging approximately 130 feet above them, but they couldn't climb up to him. The rock was too smooth, too steep, and covered in ice. Their only option was to have Kurtz somehow come down to them. The young climber was in desperate condition. One arm was completely frozen and useless. He had spent the night suspended in his harness, in sub-zero temperatures, but with his one functioning hand, he began the impossible task his rescuers asked of him. He had to cut the rope holding his dead companion above him, unravel that rope into individual strands, then braid those strands into a new rope long enough to reach the rescuers below. For 5 hours, Tony Kurz worked with one hand and his teeth. 5 hours of unimaginable effort while hanging in space, his frozen arm useless, his body shutting down. The guides below could hear him working, occasionally calling encouragement up to him. Finally, he managed to lower the makeshift rope down to them. They attached a proper rope with a carabiner and called for him to descend. Kurz began lowering himself, meter by agonizing meter. The guides reached out, ready to pull him to safety. They were so close they could almost touch him. Then the rope jammed. The knot joining Kurz's improvised rope to the rescue rope was too thick to pass through his carabiner. He needed both hands to fix it, but he only had one working hand. He hung there, just feet from his rescuers, unable to move up or down. "I'm finished," Kurz said, his voice barely a whisper. Those were his last words. Guide Arnold Glathard, who had been calling encouragement to the young climber for hours, watched as Kurz's head slowly dropped forward. His body went slack on the rope. He had died within touching distance of rescue, his reserves finally exhausted. Tony Kurz died not in a sudden fall or avalanche but slowly, fighting for life with everything he had while rescue remained perpetually just out of reach. His death haunted the guides who tried to save him and became one of mountaineering's most tragic tales. 2 years later, climbers finally conquered the Eiger's north face, passing near where Kurz had made his final stand against the mountain that killed him by inches. On the evening of November 24th, 2009, 26-year-old John Edward Jones squeezed into a narrow opening in Utah's Nutty Putty Cave, thinking he had found a passage called the Birth Canal. Instead, he had crawled headfirst into an unmapped section that angled sharply downward. Within seconds, he realized his mistake. The tunnel was getting tighter, not wider. When he tried to back out, his body wedged firmly into place. He was stuck upside down, his arms pinned beneath him, in a space so narrow his chest was compressed. What followed was one of the most nightmarish rescue attempts in caving history. John Jones was an experienced caver who had visited Nutty Putty multiple times before. He was a medical student at the University of Virginia, recently married, with a young daughter and another child on the way. The day before Thanksgiving, he had come to the cave with his brother Josh and a group of friends and family for what was supposed to be a fun adventure. The cave was popular with local cavers precisely because it was challenging, a maze of tight passages that required crawling, squeezing, and contorting through narrow spaces. Around 8 o'clock that evening, John decided to explore what he thought was a familiar tunnel. He moved past a section called Bob's Push and entered what appeared to be another tight passage. Cavers often navigated these spaces by feel, in near total darkness. John crawled forward and downward at an angle, his body sliding deeper into the tunnel. Then the walls closed in around him. He was trapped in a space roughly 10 inches wide and 18 inches high, positioned head down at an angle between 70 and 80 degrees. His brother Josh heard him call out that he was stuck. At first, no one was overly concerned. Cavers often got temporarily wedged and worked themselves free. But as minutes turned to hours, it became clear this was different. John couldn't move backward. Every breath he took made his chest expand, wedging him tighter into the crevice. The angle of his body meant gravity was pulling all his blood toward his head and chest. Even for a healthy young man, this position was unsustainable. Josh crawled back out to call for help. By 11 o'clock that night, rescue crews from multiple counties had arrived at the cave. What they found when they reached John was a rescue scenario with almost no good options. Susie Motola, one of the first rescuers to reach him, later described the horrifying reality. We could see his feet and his legs, but he was so far down and at such an angle. The space was so tight that most rescuers couldn't even reach him. For several hours, rescuers worked in shifts, crawling through hundreds of feet of narrow passages just to reach John's location. The heat in the cave was oppressive, and rescuers could only work for short periods before exhaustion and overheating forced them out. They tried everything. They drilled into the rock to install anchors. They used a complex pulley system attached to John's legs, attempting to pull him free. Around midnight, in a moment that gave everyone hope, they actually succeeded in moving John upward about 12 inches. Rescuers could see more of his body. They were making progress. Then one of the bolts anchoring the pulley system broke free from the soft rock. John slid back down into the crevice, deeper than before. The setback was devastating. That was a gut punch, Rescue Commander Susie Matola recalled. We had him out, and then he was back in. Throughout the ordeal, rescuers managed to thread a radio down to John so he could communicate. He remained remarkably calm, talking about his wife Emily and his daughter. He prayed with the rescuers. He asked them to tell his family he loved them, but his body was failing. The inverted position was causing his organs to compress his lungs. His heart was struggling to pump blood upward against gravity. He was developing shock. Rescuers considered increasingly desperate options. Could they break his legs to pull him free? Could they amputate? Even these extreme measures seemed impossible given the confined space and his deteriorating condition. They needed specialized equipment and more time to set up another pulley system, but time was the one resource they didn't have. Around midnight on November 25th, after being trapped for approximately 27 hours, John Jones lost consciousness. Rescuers threaded an IV line down to him and continued working frantically, but his heart had been pushed beyond its limits. Shortly after midnight, John Edward Jones was declared dead, his body still wedged in the narrow tunnel 150 feet below the surface. The devastating decision was made not to retrieve his body. The risk to rescuers was too great, and the cave's unstable structure meant any further attempts could cause a collapse. On November 25th, officials sealed the tunnel with concrete and explosives, making John's final resting place inside the passage that killed him. Nutty Putty Cave was permanently closed. I think it's great that they're closing the cave, Emily Jones, John's widow, said afterward. I know a lot of people will disagree, but it is the right thing to do in this situation. She had been waiting at the cave entrance throughout the rescue, pregnant with their second child, holding hope until the very end. John Jones died in absolute darkness, compressed in stone, positioned in a way that slowly suffocated him, while rescuers worked desperately just feet away, but unable to save him. His death transformed Nutty Putty Cave from a popular recreation site into a sealed tomb, a place where a young father's adventure became an inescapable trap that no amount of courage or effort could overcome. On October 5, 2003, park rangers arrived at a remote campsite in Alaska's Katmai National Park to investigate a disturbing report. What they found was a scene of unimaginable violence. The remains of 46-year-old Timothy Treadwell and his girlfriend, 37-year-old Amy Huguenard, were scattered across the camp. A large male grizzly bear was still at the scene, aggressively guarding what was left of their bodies. The animal had to be shot before rangers could even approach. For 13 summers, Timothy Treadwell had lived among the grizzly bears of Katmai, camping in their territory and filming himself interacting with some of the largest predators on Earth. He called himself the Grizzly Man, and believed he had a special connection with the bears. He gave them names like Mr. Chocolate and Rowdy. He spoke to them in a baby voice. He touched them, got within feet of them, and filmed hundreds of hours of footage showing him living alongside animals that could kill him with a single swipe of their paw. Treadwell saw himself as the bears' protector, though park officials repeatedly pointed out that the bears in Katmai were already protected, and his presence was more likely causing harm than good. He was treating wild animals as if they were people in bear costumes, one park ranger later commented. Wildlife biologists warned him constantly that his behavior was dangerous and that he was sending a deadly message to the public about how to interact with bears. But Treadwell believed he was different. He claimed the bears accepted him, trusted him, even loved him. In his footage and writings, he expressed an almost mystical belief that he could communicate with them, and that they would never hurt him. I will die for these animals, he said in one of his videos. I will die for these animals. It was a prophecy he would fulfill in the most horrific way imaginable. The fall of 2003 marked Treadwell's 13th season in Katmai. He had planned to leave in late September, but extended his stay into October, well past the time when most bears had established their feeding patterns before hibernation. This was the most dangerous time to be in bear country. The animals were hyperphagia, desperately consuming as many calories as possible before winter, and far more aggressive than during summer months. Treadwell was not alone that year. His girlfriend Amy Huguenard had joined him, though friends later said she was terrified of the bears and only went to Alaska because she was worried about Timothy being alone. In audio recordings from that final trip, Amy could be heard expressing fear and urging Timothy to leave. He refused. On October 5th, a pilot arrived to pick them up for their scheduled departure. When he landed at the lake near their camp and received no response to his calls, he knew something was wrong. He flew over the campsite and saw a large bear on top of what appeared to be a human ribcage. He immediately contacted park rangers. What investigators later pieced together was a sustained and brutal attack. The bear had come into camp and killed Timothy first. The video camera was on during the attack, though the lens cap was on, recording 6 minutes of audio, but no video. On that recording, Timothy can be heard screaming, "Come out here. I'm getting killed out here." Then Amy's voice joins in, screaming for Timothy to fight back, to play dead, her terror escalating as the attack continues. Willie Fulton, the pilot who discovered the scene, later said, "I've never heard anything like it. The sounds on that tape, I can't describe them. It was just horror." Park officials who listened to the audio as part of the investigation were traumatized by what they heard. The tape has never been released to the public. The evidence suggested Amy could have fled. She had time to run, to save herself while the bear was focused on Timothy. But she stayed. She tried to fight off an animal that weighed over 1,000 pounds, using nothing but her fists and a frying pan. Her remains were found near Timothy's, suggesting she died trying to save him. Rangers killed the bear that was still at the scene, an older male with worn teeth who likely saw the humans as an easy food source. In the bear's stomach and around the camp, they found the remains of both victims. A second bear, a younger male, was also killed after showing aggressive behavior toward the recovery team. Joel Palovac, Treadwell's close friend and the executor of his estate, made the decision to destroy the audio tape after listening to it once. "It's horrific," she said. "That tape should not exist. It should never see the light of day." Werner Herzog, who later made a documentary about Treadwell called Grizzly Man, listened to the tape with headphones while Palovac watched. He told her afterward, "You must never listen to this again. You should destroy it." Timothy Treadwell spent 13 years believing he had transcended the normal rules between humans and predators. He thought his love for the bears would protect him, that his intentions mattered to wild animals operating on instinct and hunger. In the end, he died exactly the way experts had warned him he would, and he took with him a woman who was terrified but loved him enough to stay. The bears he claimed to protect killed him and his girlfriend, then were killed themselves because of his recklessness. On August 1st, 2008, 24 climbers from various international expeditions stood on the summit of K2, the world's second highest mountain. They had achieved what many consider mountaineering's greatest challenge, but their celebration would be brief. Within the next 36 hours, 11 of those climbers would be dead, victims of a cascade of failures and disasters that turned triumph into one of the deadliest events in mountaineering history. K2, straddling the Pakistan-China border, has earned its reputation as the Savage Mountain. Nearly 1 in 4 climbers who attempt to reach its summit never return. At 28,251 feet, it stands nearly 800 feet shorter than Everest, but its technical difficulty and unpredictable weather make it far more dangerous. The mountain's pyramid shape channels wind and storms with devastating force, and its slopes are constantly threatened by avalanches and collapsing seracs, massive blocks of glacial ice that can fall without warning. The summer of 2008 brought multiple expeditions to K2, all hoping to take advantage of a narrow weather window. Teams from Serbia, Norway, Italy, France, South Korea, Nepal, and other nations established camps along the Abruzzi Ridge route. Among them were some of the world's most accomplished climbers, including Italian Marco Confortola, Norwegian Cecily Skog, and Serbian Dren Mandic. The summit push began on the night of July 31st. The plan was to climb through darkness and reach the top at dawn, then descend before afternoon weather rolled in. But almost immediately, problems emerged. A critical section near the summit, called the bottleneck, a narrow couloir beneath hanging glaciers, had not been properly fixed with ropes earlier in the expedition. Climbers were forced to wait in the dark, at extreme altitude, while team members worked to set the ropes. Hours were lost. The careful timing that keeps climbers safe was already falling apart. Despite the delays, climbers continued upward. By early afternoon on August 1st, over 24 people had reached the summit. They took photos, embraced, and began their descent. But they were descending far later than planned. Exhausted from the long climb and the hours spent waiting, the sun was high, warming the ice above the bottleneck. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, disaster struck. A massive serac collapsed above the bottleneck, sending tons of ice crashing down the mountain. The avalanche severed the fixed ropes that climbers depended on to navigate the treacherous descent. Worse, it swept away several climbers who were traversing the slope at that moment. Among those killed instantly was Dren Mandik, one of Serbia's most experienced high-altitude climbers. Jahan Baig, a Pakistani high-altitude porter, was also swept away. Several other climbers were injured or knocked off their feet but managed to arrest their falls. What happened next was chaos. Climbers were now stranded high on the mountain without fixed ropes in deteriorating weather, many suffering from altitude sickness and exhaustion. Some had lost their ice axes in the avalanche. Others were disoriented and making irrational decisions, a common effect of oxygen deprivation at extreme altitude. Rolf Bay, a Norwegian climber, was descending with his wife Cecilie Skog when another avalanche swept him off the mountain. Skog watched her husband disappear into the void. "I saw him being taken by the avalanche," she later said. "I saw his headlamp go further and further down. And then it was gone." She survived only because she was positioned slightly to the side of the avalanche path. As darkness fell on August 1st, multiple climbers were still high on the mountain, moving slowly or not moving at all. Gerard MacDonald, an Irish climber who had become the first person from Ireland to summit K2, had stayed high on the mountain to help rescue Korean climbers who had become separated from their group. Witnesses reported seeing MacDonald and the Korean climbers together around 8,000 meters. Then another avalanche came down. MacDonald and 2 of the Korean climbers, Kim Hyo-gyong and Park Kyung-hyo, were killed. Jomek Bote, a Nepali Sherpa, was attempting to descend when he became entangled in ropes. Other climbers reported seeing him hanging, unable to free himself, slowly dying from exhaustion and exposure through the night. By morning, he was dead, still suspended on the mountain face. Marco Confortola, the Italian climber, suffered severe frostbite and became disoriented during his descent. He later described seeing climbers who had simply sat down to rest and never got up again. "The mountain was taking people," he said. "One by one, they were just gone." Wilco van Rooyen, a Dutch climber who survived, spent a night bivouacking at 27,000 feet without shelter. He described the experience as being in a frozen hell, hallucinating, his body shutting down. "I was sure I was going to die," he later recounted. "I made my peace with it." He survived only because he managed to continue moving at first light. By August 2nd, the scale of the disaster was becoming clear. 11 climbers were dead or missing, and presumed dead. Among the victims were some of the most experienced high-altitude mountaineers in the world. The causes were multiple: avalanches, falls, exhaustion, altitude sickness, and poor decisions made by oxygen-starved brains. Fredrik Strang, a Swedish climber who reached the summit and survived the descent, later said, "What happened on K2 was not one thing. It was everything going wrong at once. Small delays became big problems. Big problems became fatal." The 2008 K2 disaster remains one of mountaineering's darkest chapters. In a single weather window, on a single route, 11 people died on a mountain that had long warned climbers of its savage nature. The bottleneck, where the tragedy unfolded, is still littered with the bodies of those who never made it down, permanent monuments to the day when the savage mountain lived up to its name, and reminded the world that at extreme altitude, the margin between success and catastrophe can vanish in seconds. On July 22, 2013, 66-year-old Geraldine Largay stepped off the Appalachian Trail in western Maine to use the bathroom. She had been hiking alone that day, while her husband drove ahead to meet her at the next road crossing. When she tried to return to the trail, she couldn't find it. Within minutes of leaving the path, The experienced hiker became disoriented in the dense forest. She would never find her way back. 26 days later, she died alone in the woods, less than 2 miles from the trail, despite desperate attempts to signal for help. Geraldine, known to friends and family as Jerry, had dreamed of hiking the Appalachian Trail for years. The 2,000-mile footpath, stretching from Georgia to Maine, represented adventure and accomplishment. In April of 2013, she set out from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, planning to hike the northern section of the trail. Her husband George accompanied her for portions of the journey, but Jerry often hiked alone during the day while George would drive ahead and meet her at designated road crossings. By late July, Jerry had reached a remote section of the trail in Maine, passing through the Reddington Township area. The forest there is notoriously thick, with dense undergrowth and heavy tree cover that can disorient even experienced hikers. On the morning of July 22nd, Jerry left her campsite at Poplar Ridge Lean-To and continued north. At some point during the day, she stepped off the trail to relieve herself. The last entry in her journal that she made while still on the trail read, "Showers off and on all day. The river was over my knee-high boots." What happened next was every hiker's nightmare. The forest in that area looks the same in every direction. There were no landmarks, no clear sightlines, and the thick canopy blocked views of the sun that might have helped with orientation. Jerry wandered, trying to find the trail, but with each step she moved further from the path. Within hours, she was hopelessly lost. George Largay waited at the planned meeting spot. When Jerry didn't arrive, he initially wasn't alarmed. She had been delayed before, but as hours turned into a full day, he contacted authorities. On July 24th, a massive search operation began. The Maine Warden Service deployed search teams, helicopters, and trained dogs. Volunteers combed the woods. The search expanded to cover thousands of acres around the area where Jerry was last seen. What searchers didn't know was that Jerry had her cell phone with her and was desperately trying to call for help. Between July 23rd and July 25th, she sent multiple text messages to George and their daughter. "In some trouble. Read one message. Got off trail to go to Brilf, now lost. Can you call AMC to see if a trail maintainer can help me? Somewhere north of Woods Road, Xox." Once more, she attempted to message George. She said, "Lost since yesterday, off trail 3 or 4 miles, call police for what to do, please." But none of the messages went through. The forest was too dense, and there were no cell towers in range. The text sat in her phone's outbox, unsent, while rescue teams searched miles away. Jerry's training and experience worked against her in one critical way. She knew the standard advice for lost hikers: stay put and wait for rescue. She found a spot near a stream, set up her tent, and waited. She displayed survival knowledge by conserving her energy and staying near water. But her location was in a heavily forested area with no clearings, making her nearly impossible to spot from the air. The search helicopters flew overhead multiple times, but the thick tree canopy concealed her tent completely. In her journal, Jerry documented her ordeal with heartbreaking detail. She wrote letters to her family. "When you find my body, please call my husband George." One entry read, followed by his phone number. She wrote about her love for her family, her regret at the pain her death would cause them, and her growing acceptance of her fate. The entries tracked her physical decline as days passed without rescue. The official search was suspended after several weeks. The Maine Warden Service had covered thousands of acres and found no trace of Jerry. George and their daughter Carrie refused to give up, hiring private search teams and returning to Maine repeatedly to continue looking. But the forest kept its secret. More than 2 years later, in October of 2015, a forester surveying land in the area discovered Jerry's campsite. Her remains were inside her tent, along with her journal and the unsent text messages on her phone. She had survived for at least 26 days after getting lost, rationing her limited food supplies and waiting for a rescue that never came. Her tent was just 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail and about 3,000 feet from the nearest logging road. The Maine Warden Service later acknowledged that the search had not adequately covered the area where Jerry was found. "Despite its proximity to the trail, we searched a lot of areas, but we didn't search that specific spot," said Lieutenant Kevin Adam. "It's difficult terrain, and in hindsight, we should have extended our search grid." George Largay, speaking after his wife's body was found, said, "She did everything she was supposed to do. She stayed put. She tried to signal. She rationed her food. She just got unlucky with her location. The couple's daughter, Carrie, described reading her mother's journal as one of the most painful experiences of her life. "She didn't give up," Carrie said. "She fought to stay alive for almost a month, and she never stopped hoping someone would find her." Geraldine Largay's death exposed the terrifying reality that even experienced hikers can become lost within minutes of leaving a trail, and that modern technology cannot always save us in remote wilderness. She died doing everything right, just yards from paths that could have led to safety. Her calls for help trapped in a phone with no signal. The forest that had seemed so inviting from the trail became a green maze with no exit. And Jerry Largay spent her final weeks writing goodbye letters to the family she would never see again. On the morning of February 4th, 1912, Franz Reichelt stood on the first platform of the Eiffel Tower, 187 feet above the frozen ground of Paris. The 48-year-old tailor was dressed in a bizarre contraption of his own design, a suit made of silk and canvas that he believed would allow him to float safely to the ground. Newspapers had been invited. Cameras were rolling. A crowd had gathered below. What they were about to witness would become one of the most disturbing pieces of footage ever captured. A man's final 4 seconds of life as his dream of flight turned into free fall. Franz Reichelt was obsessed with solving one of aviation's deadliest problems. In the early 20th century, pilots were dying in crashes at alarming rates, and parachute technology was primitive at best. Several inventors were competing to create a practical parachute that could be worn and deployed quickly. Reichelt, an Austrian tailor living in Paris, became convinced he had the answer. His design was a wearable parachute suit that combined fabric wings with a deployable canopy, intended to transform the wearer into something like a human flying squirrel. For months, Reichelt conducted tests from his apartment on the Rue Gaillon, dropping dummies dressed in versions of his suit from the 5th-floor window. The results were inconsistent and often disastrous. Dummies crashed to the pavement with sickening regularity. The few times the suit seemed to work, providing some resistance, were enough to keep Reichelt's hope alive. He modified the design repeatedly, adding more fabric, adjusting the framework, convinced that each iteration brought him closer to success. By early 1912, Reichelt had secured permission from Parisian authorities to conduct a demonstration from the Eiffel Tower. He told officials and friends that he would drop a dummy wearing the suit to prove its effectiveness. The prefecture of police approved the test on the condition that it was conducted early in the morning to minimize disruption. Le Figaro and other Paris newspapers announced the upcoming demonstration. Cameramen arrived to document what promised to be either a breakthrough or a spectacular failure. What nobody expected was that Reichelt had decided to make himself the test subject. When friends arrived that morning and saw him wearing the suit, they were horrified. The contraption was enormous, adding significant bulk to his small frame. The fabric hung limp and heavy in the cold morning air. Witnesses later reported that the suit weighed approximately 75 pounds. "We begged him not to do it," one friend told reporters afterward. "We told him to at least test it with a dummy first, from this height. He refused to listen." Another associate, who had helped Reichelt with earlier tests, said, "He was convinced that a living person's movements would make the difference, that he could control the descent in ways a dummy could not." The temperature that morning was below freezing. Wind gusts swept across the tower's platform. Reichelt climbed the stairs slowly, burdened by the weight of his invention. Once on the platform, he began to hesitate. Film footage captured by the Pathé Company shows him standing at the edge, peering over, then stepping back. He did this repeatedly. He placed a chair near the edge and stood on it, testing his position. He looked down at the crowd below. Reporters called up to him, some still believing this was a test run with a dummy to follow. For 41 minutes, Reichelt stood on that platform. The footage shows a man wrestling with terror. His face, visible in the grainy film, betrayed his fear. At one point, he spread his arms tentatively, and the fabric of the suit barely moved. There was almost no air resistance. Several people in the crowd below shouted for him to come down, sensing the danger. Finally, at approximately 8:20 in the morning, Reichelt made his decision. He climbed fully onto the chair positioned at the platform's edge. He stood upright, raised his arms to spread the wing-like fabric, and stepped off into empty space. The film captured everything. The suit did not deploy. The fabric did not catch the air, or billow out as intended. Reichelt simply dropped like a stone, his body rigid, falling straight down. There was no gliding, no floating, no reduction in speed. He fell for approximately 4 seconds and struck the frozen ground with catastrophic force. The impact was so severe, It created a crater in the earth 5.5 inches deep. Dr. Philippe Chardiniers, who examined the body immediately after, confirmed Rourkel died on impact. His skull was fractured, his legs and arms were broken, and his spine was shattered. The doctor noted that death would have been instantaneous. Among the witnesses was a journalist from Le Matin who wrote, "We saw him hesitate, and then he jumped. The parachute did not open. He fell like a mass. The impact was terrible." Another reporter present that day stated, "It was clear from the moment he jumped that the apparatus had failed completely. There was no resistance at all." Investigation of the suit revealed fundamental design flaws. The fabric was too heavy relative to its surface area. The framework that was supposed to deploy and maintain the canopy's shape had no mechanism to actually open when needed. Even if everything had worked as Reichelt imagined, physics experts calculated that the suit could not have generated enough drag to prevent a fatal impact from that height. Friends later revealed that Reichelt had faced mounting pressure. He had invested his life savings into the suit's development and modification. Other inventors were working on similar concepts, and he feared being beaten to a solution. Financial desperation and the desire for recognition may have pushed him to take a risk he knew in his heart was premature. The film of Franz Reichelt's death circulated widely in the years after, shown in newsreels as a cautionary tale. Over a century later, that footage remains one of the most haunting documents of human ambition meeting tragic reality. It shows a man standing alone on a platform, paralyzed by fear but unable to back down, and then falling through the air in the final seconds of his life while cameras recorded every moment. His death contributed nothing to parachute development, but everything to the historical record of why human test subjects should never be the first trial of an unproven invention. And that brings us to the end of this episode. If you found this video informative, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what we drop next. We cover stories like this almost every day, and trust me, you don't want to be left behind. If you can't wait until the next upload, there are more videos popping up on your screen in just a few seconds. Click one and keep watching. Until then, take care. I'm out.